if there is such government investment going into a project like this, how do you measure the return on that investment? And that's the question that EORN and the Ontario government, OMAFRA, the Ministry of Government Services, came to the Monieson Centre to ask. So that's some of the work that we're currently engaging in. And so we're going to welcome our research team to come and discuss that. You don't have to one of our team members to discuss.
Okay, thanks very much for the opportunity to share with you an overview of the project that was initiated by the provincial government with respect to trying to understand what kind of framework we could put together to track and evaluate the impacts, various types of impacts, in fact, of a rural broadband project like the Eastern Ontario Regional Network, although the hope is that the results that emerge from this should be useful to others as well. So there are certainly different types of impacts that we'll be looking at. We're looking primarily at changes in the economic circumstances across the Eastern Ontario region, and in other places the same phenomena could be looked at, and perhaps the structure of the economy, looking at social and cultural development, and financial ROI for those who are making investments, whether that's public or private. We just had a little discussion on that. There could be some implications for community pride and certainly expectations for a more vibrant community and civic life in these communities. But one of the things that we appreciate is that different stakeholders, and I just sort of informally run through a number of them there, have different priorities. So that poses some real challenges when you're trying to identify the kinds of indicators that could help you measure whether or not there actually has been an effect from the introduction of a rural broadband network. And we'll see what I mean here momentarily. So some of the considerations that we need to keep in mind, of course, are what would the indicator be for any particular impact that we would be looking at, and what would the specific measure be that we'd be looking at. And those are somewhat different. An example would be economic growth might be an example of an indicator you'd be looking at, but the measure might be on a firm basis, a percentage increase in sales. So that's the distinction that we would make. We also recognize that there's a need for quantitative and qualitative indicators for many of the areas of action that we'd be looking at. We're interested in the absolutes, the percentages, and the indices. Those kinds of measures may have different levels of appropriateness in different areas. We're also asking ourselves, does the data exist or can we get it? Chris Horn mentioned a little bit about the challenges on the data front earlier, and certainly in rural areas that's a specific concern. Primary and or secondary data may or may not be available. The coverage may not cover the geography that you're looking for or have the degree of granularity you're looking for. Representativeness of the samples is also potentially a concern. The timeliness and the timelines for some of the data collection and the evaluation of that data varies according to the time or framework which you would expect to see a particular impact. And the big issue, and Chris Horn made reference to this as well, is that there are often other influences on the relationship that you're trying to study that you may or may not be able to tease apart, so you can take a look specifically at what the impact of rural broadband has been in a particular community or for various reasons. So the province of Ontario then, the project that the Monieson Centre has been working on for the province has actually detailed more than 50, I think it's 59 priority indicators in 4 different categories: access, adoption, the social impact of rural broadband, and the economic impact. And in brackets there we've just shown the number of indicators in each of those 4 categories. And in the box on the blue box on the right, you'll see that certainly anticipate using these indicators and tracking this kind of information in concert with the role of and the implementation and use of EORN. So while the Monieson team was putting this together, we took a look at a number of different elements of these considerations. There were obviously a full-scale literature review to see what else might be out there from other communities that we could take a look at, or other projects, expert interviews with people particularly knowledgeable in the field, focus groups, and the outreach consultations to determine what the expectations might be and what kinds of indicators might be seen as useful on a community basis, and so on. And we also took a look at things like intelligent community factors, critical success factors on that front. So you can see there was quite a bit of work done to try and distill down all the information that we might obtain on that particular front. So I'll go through fairly quickly the 4 categories of indicators here. So the access indicator might be thought of, indicators might be thought of as supply side considerations. The availability and speed of the connection. Is it really available? Is broadband really available, and on what basis? We've shown the benchmark here, speed test results and so on that could be used to establish that. Pricing considerations, and we've had a little bit of discussion about that just moments ago. The quality of the service and the characteristics that we would associate with that. And then finally, competitiveness of the markets and what the impact is if there is a monopolistic circumstance. So in a sense, there was expectation and aspirations to have at least 2 ISPs in any given market to introduce that competitive element. Adoption, on the other hand, is a bit of a supply side consideration. So we're looking at indicators like broadband subscriptions, the uptake of the availability and use of that, and the consumption, the total amount of broadband service that's actually being consumed. Consumer awareness and the perceived need for connectivity was another indicator that we identified under this category because it could influence the degree to which people adopt high-speed. 30-year the barriers to broadband adoption, whether they're financial or non-financial. A couple of examples of that. Broadband adoption outside of the home or business, that being primarily public sites and the ability to use that, might be considered whether or not mobile might be in that category as well. And then training and digital literacy, the degree to which there are perceived needs for training and that's being fulfilled and the skill levels that get associated with that. Again, goes back to something that Chris Foreman was talking about earlier this morning. When we then look to outcome style impacts, we can think about social impacts across a number of different indicator types. So what we're looking at are educational attainment impacts, what impact broadband might have on high school graduation rates, post-secondary education enrollment, and use of broadband for online courses, people who have done that or are intending to do so. So we can see if there's any impact there. Because, as we all know, level of education correlates with incomes and economic prosperity, and social prosperity as well. So we can look at that. Population retention and stabilization is a major issue in rural areas and certainly in eastern Ontario. So we'd be looking at, in that case, of changes that are taking place in the community's populations by age group, the migration and migratory patterns of young people or older folks as well, what's happening on those fronts. And then a particular focus on e-health and the impact that broadband could have on e-health, telemedicine utilization, the impact on patient travel if you don't have to drive an hour to get to a healthcare provider, and you can do that closer to your home, for instance, and the impact of e-health services on chronic conditions like diabetes being one of the primary ones that we look at. In these kinds of impacts, as well as economic impacts, we find that there's always this real challenge of compounding variables, so that's the term I would use for it. How can you really be sure that some of the impacts you might see down the road are coming from the introduction of broadband as opposed to a dozen other factors that might be taking place in your communities? And these kinds of social indicators that we're talking about are susceptible to that as well. So is high school graduation rate, is that actually affected by broadband, or is it also affected by a dozen other things? Which we could probably all toss out a number of ideas of what those might be. So that's always one of the things that we have to keep in mind is how clean is that relationship between the dependent and independent variables? Can we actually say conclusively that that's an impact? Some others that we're looking at on the social impact side are the impacts on service delivery, on the impact of use of communications and social networks, and social sustainability and community well-being. And you can see that under each of these categories there are a number of other sub-indicators if we want to think of it that way. So a very comprehensive look at what kinds of social impacts people may be expecting as a result of the introduction of a broadband network. So if you're getting the sense that perhaps it's going to take a lot of time and energy to actually answer these questions about whether or not there's been an impact, you're quite right. On the economic front, again, there are 5 subcategories here. Obviously, job creation and stability of those jobs is a major concern for all of the government as well as the community and the labor force. The employment impact of the network itself and the industry of people working with the network and the industry, the IT industry. Property values and municipal tax bases, which are important to sustain local services. So those are key issues, as well as obviously the economic impact on business and economic development. And we've chosen just a number of very tight, I would call very tight indicators here, which perhaps stand a better chance of us being able to actually measure impact to the business websites and social or interactive applications, for instance, being one of those. I would just draw your attention to the 4th bullet point here, the impact on SME formation, innovation, performance, and market of the service. This is certainly an area where, from an economic development point of view, we're very interested in what the impact of broadband would be. But there is very little data on SME generally, let alone how they've been formed and how they're doing on the innovation front. So that's going to be a challenging one to try and gather that information. I think it's pretty clear we're going to do some primary research on that front. Economic impact on e-services is the last one on this list, but certainly quite important to use of government e-services and business applications and the impact on sales and markets and so on. So again, on the economic development, economic impact front, many indicators that we can take a look at. So just quickly, in summary, I just want to point out, just remind you that it's really important to identify the indicators and establish the baseline before the infrastructure investments are made. We're just on the edge of running across that line now as the E1 network is unfolding and coming to life. So we're wanting to get that information about what was the world like before this was introduced, so that down the road we can see if we move the needle. Secondly, just the challenges of establishing those direct causal relationships between the dependent and independent variables. Big challenge. We have to work very hard to refine that and tease apart any of the variables, if we can, that might be having an impact aside from broadband. Thirdly, the availability of secondary data can be an issue in rural areas. Typically, for instance, most research, if we get down to the provincial level, we're doing well, but let alone get down to, say, a county or community level, very challenging. So primary research is definitely going to be required, and almost certainly, especially when we're looking at social impacts, qualitative and quantitative approaches are going to be necessary. So where this particular project is at right now is that for the evaluation of the Eastern Ontario Regional Network, the efforts are underway now to see if we can get some of the work that I've just given you a bit of a view on to get that funded so that we can analyze that over a 10-year period. That's kind of the time frame over which we expect these impacts to